Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. There's been a dramatic development in the battle between increasing press regulation and freedom of the press in the UK. Plans by the industry to regulate itself have apparently been rejected, and that's ahead of a Privy Council meeting on Wednesday. Back in March, the main political party leaders agreed to set up a new watchdog by royal charter, with powers to impose £1 million fines on publishers and demand upfront apologies from them. But the newspapers said some of the recommendations were unworkable and gave politicians an unacceptable degree of interference. It, in turn, has come up with its own proposals, which it said would be among the toughest press regulation in the free world. A report by Lord Justice Leveson into the practices of the press followed a phone hacking scandal involving the murdered teenager Millie Dowler. The reaction to that report was that newspapers needed to put their house in order, but most think that this needs to be balanced with the need to maintain a vigorous and free press. To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Lance Price. He's the former Director of Communications for the Labour Party and author of A History of Politics and the Media, Where Power Lies. Also here in the studio is Sunny Hundal, who is a blogger and a lecturer in journalism at Kingston University. On the line, we're joined by Angela Phillips, who is a reader in journalism at Goldsmiths and is also with the Ethics Committee for Media Reform, and she gave evidence to the Leveson inquiry. On the line is the editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt. First of all, Lance Price, the press insists that this would have been the toughest regulation in the Western world. It doesn't seem to be good enough. Why do you think that is?
I think the problem that the press have with this is that they simply don't have the public behind them, and the politicians feel that they do. There's actually remarkably little between the two positions. If you dig down into the detail of what the two alternatives suggest, there isn't a huge amount of difference between them. Those newspapers that have come together to oppose the recommendation that has now been made by all three political parties, and that in itself is pretty unusual that the three parties have come together and pretty well agreed on a formula for dealing with this. Those newspapers that oppose that are insisting that freedom of the press, freedom of the media, freedom of expression has to be paramount, and that any even slight intrusion upon that, which gives the impression that the government of the day has the power to impose penalties on the media, or even could have the power in the future to impose penalties on the media, has to be unacceptable.
Sunny Hundal, I mean, Lance makes the point that there was very little difference in the proposals, but that's not the perception, certainly from the press. They're saying that this would strangle what they do. What do you see the shortcomings as being?
No, you're right that certainly it is not the perception of the press that there's very little difference between the two. And yesterday there was a bizarre interview with Fraser Nelson on the BBC, where on the one hand...
He's the editor of the Spectator magazine.
Yeah, sorry, editor of the Spectator magazine. On the one hand, claiming there was very little difference. On the other hand, saying actually we find this unacceptable that the government is seeking to regulate the press. So they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. But there is a difference, actually, and the difference is that the press version of the charter gives them much more leeway and allows them, firstly, to ignore complaints by people, whereas the government charter says, no, they have to have some form of arbitration on every complaint. And then secondly, that the press charter gives them, the editors, a lot more control over the direction and allows them to not take part if they want to. And there's a lot more autonomy that they have within that, whereas the government is saying, no, you have to have a charter where everyone has to sign up to. So there are some key differences which could lead on to some major differences in how the press is regulated. So I see why they're annoyed, but as Lance said, that the public opinion is firmly against them.
Angela Phillips, do you see it that way? The public opinion is firmly against them? Because certainly Lord Justice Leveson himself, he wanted something properly independent. And it's felt, I think, that this doesn't really meet that standard.
The editor's idea, the proprietor's idea for a new press organisation would simply be a reprise of exactly the same as they've already got, but they wanted to organise it in such a way that it would contain a triple lock, ensuring that there could never, in the future, ever be any reform of the ethical system in this country again. So not only were they ignoring what Leveson says, but they were saying, in future, we will not countenance any change. The press are doing far more than they pretend they are. And another thing that I think is really critical and has got left out of most discussion on this is that the agreed three-party arrangements would have involved ordinary journalists in the organisation that will be set up to regulate. The press barons and the editors don't want that. They don't want ordinary journalists involved. They don't mind having members of the public because, in a sense, they will control the members of the public, as they always have done on the Press Complaints Commission. But they want to be there as editors. They don't want ordinary journalists involved. And I think that that is something that really ought to have a bit more scrutiny, because my concern has always been that when newspapers behave badly, it's nearly always because editors put a great deal of pressure on ordinary journalists to do things that they quite often think are unethical. And I think that any new arrangement from the press should represent ordinary journalists as well as editors.
Ian Dunt, I just want to bring you in. I'm just wondering what you think, first of all, on the view that this would actually strangle the press.
It certainly won't strangle the press, and we've heard a lot of almost biblical level rhetoric from the press, about the end of free speech. It's basically as if, Mussolini was marching into London tomorrow. And most of the rhetoric has been completely unsuitable for the proposals that have been put forward. However, I would like to add a caveat to that, specifically around the triple lock. It is still incumbent on us when we're discussing these issues to think about ways, and this isn't too 1984-y, but to think about ways that a future tyrannical government could manipulate the system so that it could impose restrictions on the press. And I would suggest that being the case, the triple lock mechanism, which is basically that you need to have unanimous support by the Press Trade Association, by the watchdog itself, and by the recognition body, is a superior system to the idea of just having a two-thirds majority in favour of change in the Commons and the Lords. This is an area, as long as we think that currently you're dealing with something that is satisfactory in the Charter, that seems a sensible precaution to take.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing press regulation in the UK with Lance Price, the former Director of Communications for the Labour Party, Sunny Hundal, a blogger and journalist, Angela Phillips, Senior Reader in Journalism at Goldsmiths, University of London, and Ian Dunt, Editor of Politics.co.uk. The point is that in the future, there's no guarantee that 10, 15, 20 years down the line that a government may use a tougher regulation to quash what the press do.
Yeah, no, that's true. But we can have scenarios on either side. On the one hand, they are putting forward the scenario that a government could quash the press to push forward its view. On the other side, you could argue that on an everyday basis, the press is going to carry on smearing people, and it's going to carry on smearing not just dead people, but also immigrants, minorities, disability people who are disabled, etc. And they have no recourse to get those newspapers to withdraw their claims. So on both sides, people are saying that this is going to be the end of the world as we know it if we adopt the other side's charter. I think both scenarios can play out. If you want to say that the government could go forward, in any case, let's say, for example, some form of a war or you have some form of invasion. In any case, a government can make its case, and the public usually, and the media usually goes along with it anyway because they're skeptical of challenging the government when it comes to issues like national security. Regardless of whatever charter you have, some of the scenarios about a government control or a government takeover or a government squashing sort of dissent, that can happen anyway on a whole range of issues. It's kind of irrelevant which charter you pick.
But indeed, Angela Phillips, the point is, I think the press was making was that there really wasn't a transparent process. It's gone through the Privy Council. This latest news appears to have come from a leak. Why not an act of Parliament? Why not more transparency? Aren't the press right on that?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. The idiocy of all this is that nobody would have come up with the idea of a royal charter if it hadn't been for the fact that the press made such a song and dance about it in the first place. That idea came about after 2 months of discussions between the press barons and the Conservatives. So for them to say now that it's a bad way of doing it is a little disingenuous. It was their way of doing it. What they didn't like was that the opposition was actually brought into the conversation at all. They felt they should control it. For them to squeak now about it being a royal charter, they should have they should have gone along with the much simpler suggestions that Lord Leveson put forward in the first place.
Lance Price, I mean, what could happen here is a degree of self-censorship, and that smaller publications may feel that they might be in the frame for legal action and are less likely to print stories, and this could have a detrimental effect.
Well, there's a possibility that there will be a differentiation between those media organisations that are big enough and rich enough to be able to pay fines or take the risk of having to pay fines or compensation, and those who simply can't. But actually, if you look at the way in which the media is changing, the number of media organisations that have got deep pockets are very, very few and far between. The richest by far, I guess, is the Daily Mail. And they, of course, are one of the strongest opponents of the government regulation proposal that's being put forward. Again, the problem that the media have is public opinion, the newspapers have in particular, is public opinion, and the abuses that came to light and were investigated by Lord Leveson were so severe and so extreme that the public simply aren't going to accept something which allows that kind of thing to continue and allows newspaper editors and proprietors to have the largest say in terms of whether or not it's in the public interest or is a substantial public interest. Another of the differences between the two proposals is the level of public interest required before there can be compulsory arbitration. The public just won't wear it, and I think the media have to bite the bullet. They have to come to a decision fairly soon. They've probably got the most benign Prime Minister in terms of reaching out to them at the moment in the shape of David Cameron, who's given the press quite a lot of leeway in these discussions. If there's a change of government, change of Prime Minister after the general election in 18 months' time, the media, the press may find themselves in a much more difficult political situation.
And Ian, on that point about public opinion being against this, David Cameron didn't accept the findings of the Leveson inquiry either.
It's absolutely true that when the Millie Dowler story broke, there was a wave of public outrage. I actually think that's subsided quite heavily now. Really, insofar as the public are aware of this debate at all, what they see is a fight between journalists and politicians. Neither of those are groups that the public tend to like. So it's a bit like offering a child cabbage or Brussels sprouts. He's going to turn his lip up at either of them.
From someone who wants more regulation of the press, the problem is that the press themselves can easily ignore public opinion, firstly, because, as Ian says, they're not exactly enamored with politicians. And secondly, they're going to play hard in terms of their own readers and say, this is why we didn't sign up, because this is, an end to our freedom, etc., etc. So their own readers are not going to necessarily like these proposals. And then thirdly, what happens if they say no? And what does the government do? Is it going to force them by legislation? That's a possibility, but I think that's going to be more trickier and it's going to look even more draconian. So, let's just not pretend that this is going to be easy for the government. I mean, Lance is right that this is the best Prime Minister they're going to have for quite a while, but they're going to fight hard on this.
How much of a victory, Angela Phillips, do you think this is for Hacked Off? Because they'll be very pleased with this, but Trevor Kavanagh of The Sun last night on the BBC said this is a victory for the forces of oppression. Virtually every newspaper editor is against this.
Well, that's not true for a start. I mean, The Guardian isn't as small as it used to be. It now has a very big online following, and they definitely are not in favour of the editors and proprietors' view. I think that most ethical journalists are conscious of the fact that it's very difficult to look at this simply in terms of public opinion, because it actually affects the people who the press trash. And that isn't the public, that's individuals. Now, if you as an individual get attacked in one of the tabloids in this country, you have very little redress. You can be absolutely hung out to dry by the Daily Mail, and there's very little you can do about it. Most people realise and understand that a step forward that would allow people some redress, like an apology or a right of reply, is A, not going to cripple the press, and B, is actually fair. Because the press inevitably dominate the public discussion on this issue, it's very difficult to have any real debate about what this is really about. And it's really about not allowing the freedom of the press to override the freedom of the individual.
Okay, but in terms of the hacking case in particular, and you referred to, and we've been talking about Millie Dowler, that is being dealt with by current legislation. Those were criminal charges taken against the alleged perpetrators. Legislation already in place. It didn't need anything recommended by Leveson.
No, there is a lot of legislation in place. It's the other things that matter. For example, Daily Mail has been taken to the PCC 9 times between 2011 and 2012. for breaching a code of conduct, the committee of which is actually chaired by the editor of the Daily Mail, and on whose ranks sits the editor of the Mail on Sunday. These are the people, the editor of the Daily Mail in particular, who want to run journalists' ethics in this country. But they are 9 times in breach of their own rules. But did you know that? Does anybody else know about it?
So it's a problem of pupils marking their own homework effectively, I suppose. But Lance Price, I mean, let's look at the example in France. There's tighter state control. The press is heavily regulated, subsidised by the state. No company is allowed to have more than 30% of total newspaper circulation. That doesn't actually benefit readers, though. It benefits those in power, and this is the danger.
And there was a time when those sorts of proposals were being made in this country. If you roll the clock back 10, 20 years, the Labour Party, my party, was advocating restrictions on media ownership, which is certainly more of the European model than the American model. What the press say, of course, is that if you took even these fairly limited proposals now, they would be illegal, they would be unconstitutional in the United States, where freedom of information triumphs.
But we shouldn't be looking at America as a model. America has one of the lowest newspaper reading publics in the developed world. If you actually look at Scandinavia, which has a much more balanced and more ethical situation, where there are statutory attempts to ensure there is some kind of diversity of opinion, they have the highest newspaper reading public in the West, in the
I'm
democratic
not sure that
world.
correlation works. I mean, India has some of the highest readership and actually has a really chaotic
why
press.
suggest that America is a model of anything when it comes to the media?
Well,
read American newspapers.
But freedom of speech, Angela, is enshrined in the Constitution. I think that's
it may be enshrined in it, but we're moving for the debate we were having was that this would be bad for readers. Now, that is often said that if we were more ethical, nobody would read the newspapers. And then America is put up as this great example of an unfettered press. Well, nobody reads the American press, or hardly anybody does.
There are big circulations.
It's really badly read.
Okay, you're talking about the press in terms of sales of print publications, I suppose. The media landscape is changing, though, and on that point, in fact, since Leveson started preparing this report, newspaper sales in this country have declined by 1/5.
They have, and I doubt that very much that's anything to do with Leveson, because if you look at America, which is completely free, and you look at Scandinavia, which is far more ethical and more diverse, what you actually find is that we are not an example. We're not up in the top. We're not the country where everybody reads the newspapers. Most people in this country get their news from the regulated broadcasters.
Or they get it from online, and to this point, Ian Dunt...
No, they don't get it online. That's just not true.
Okay, all right.
If you actually look at the figures, the vast majority...
30 million Guardian readers online, 25 million mail.co.uk readers. I mean, there is a considerable proportion of people who do get their news online. Ian Dunt, I just want to bring in quickly, Ian Dunt, this point. I mean, I noticed that you wrote back in March that for online writers... watching the Leveson inquiry was like watching an incontinent uncle marvel at a VHS tape. So, on that point, I want to know whether or not you think the Leveson, whether these proposals will actually take into account this changing media landscape, online offerings such as your own.
Well, they did that. I mean, bafflingly, they didn't talk about us at all during the actual Leveson inquiry. And then out of nowhere, at the end of it, they suddenly came out and thought, oh, well, you know what, we might as well try and regulate the internet. That didn't do very well. I mean, there was a consultation that I attended. The ideas that we felt from the digital industry were very strenuously made, and that idea pretty much died a death. I mean, the difference is, of course, is that there is a change with economies of scale, and what you can say about what a newspaper can afford to do certainly is not the case for what Politics.co.uk could afford to do or what Liberal Conspiracy could afford to do. So any very stringent move that way right now would kind of kill what's still a relatively nebulous industry, just at the moment that it's sort of being given birth. So that wouldn't be too wise to pursue that path immediately. However, that is something that is going to need to be formulated into how the body works in the years ahead of us.
But Ian, I mean, the big spats over the last few months, certainly that spring to mind, are involving social media and a whole manner of things that have nothing to do with the printed newspaper. I mean, I'm wondering whether or not these Leveson recommendations would have been out of date as soon as they were published anyway.
Well, they were sort of out of date before the inquiry even began, and it's true that one of the problems that you'll always have, for instance, when we tried to say maybe only small and medium-sized businesses should be subject, online businesses should be subject to this sort of thing. What they were trying to prevent is a massive newspaper, say like the Daily Mail, just creating an SME, creating a small or medium-sized business, and then chucking all of the really quite dodgy stuff into its online presence over there. So you've always got a bit of difficulty there. I'd say at the moment, it's hard enough to get agreement, even now, on what's going on with Dead Tree Press, with the debate that's taking place right now. That at least needs to be sorted before we see how the digital landscape fits into it. What goes on in social media is another thing altogether, but there's been some quite sensible guidelines, I think, recently from the Director of Public Prosecutions, which takes us to a slightly better place on that.
There is no real difference between the newspapers and their online presence. They are run by the same organisations. On the newspapers and the broadcasters are by a very long way the biggest destinations online. So there is something, again, people talk about how everything's different on the net. That actually isn't true. Now, the Daily Mail, yes, the Daily Mail does have a very different kind of presence online, but it's run by the same organisation. It is also now, probably, depending on who you count, who does the counting, one of the biggest online presences in the world. So when we're talking about size, I think to suggest that somehow going online is a different thing from buying a newspaper is just not to understand what's happening online. What's happening online is that more and more people are actually going to the same big news organisations. The minority of people go to the small ones. But, I mean, you know, the number of people who go to Political Conspiracy compared to the people who go to The Guardian, I mean, they're not even comparable in size. So when we're talking about regulating, very gently regulating, our biggest news organisations, we're talking about big organisations that work both on and offline.
This is the Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing press regulation in the UK with Lance Price, Sunny Hundal, Angela Phillips and Ian Dunt. OK, Ian Dunt, your response to that, please.
No, well, I mean, my response is merely on the sort of cultural aspect of it, that we can't really consider them in the same terms. I'm actually not, strenuously disagreeing with what was just said, but it's true that culturally there's a vast distinction. So, for instance, what I think would have been tolerable in the Mail in its printed publication, I mean, looking, for instance, at what's been happening with Ed Miliband recently, would actually be quite questionable to its online audience, who are attracted more to the stuff around celebrities, to the more gossipy aspect, and to what is ultimately a much more socially liberal product. So you're dealing with very different demographics, very different tastes, and very different ideas about, what they consider in good taste. And that would actually be reflected in the way that online publications are treated.
Angela, I just want to bring in Lance Price here. On the Ed Miliband story, there was a difference in how the newspaper covered the story. Well, certainly there was an image that was on the website that wasn't in the newspaper, or a headline that was different. I mean, I'm just wondering, in terms of that Ed Miliband row, how much of a light did that shine on the actions of the press, and how can that be dealt with by Leveson's proposals?
Well, there's 2 points to that question. It did shine a very bright light on the behaviour of the press and on the behaviour of the Daily Mail in particular, and it showed an opposition leader who was willing to stand up to what's perceived to be the power of the press, a power which I think is grossly exaggerated and has been down the years. And it was portrayed as something very sort of courageous and brave of him to do. Although I'm not sure it was all that brave. But it's interesting to see that the vast majority of people who are questioned about it, including readers of the Daily Mail, have sided with Ed Miliband in saying that it was unacceptable for the paper to smear his dead father and suggest that his dead father wasn't a patriot, despite the fact that he served in the Royal Navy and all the rest of it. The other question, however, is, would the new regulations, any of the new regulations, have made any difference? And I'm not sure that they would. I mean, others may disagree. But I would hope that even under the new regulations, the Daily Mail would still have the freedom, because it's a matter of judgment, it's a matter of opinion, if they're expressing an opinion, to run the headline that they ran.
Well, the Daily Mail would have made some difference. The regulation would have made some difference, because then Ed Miliband would have much stronger recourse to getting the Daily Mail to withdraw some of the allegations against his father. And so
it would have failed. I mean, I don't think Ed Miliband would have taken this to any kind of press complaints commission. In fact,
he said
an exemplary case.
He said he didn't want to take it to the PCC, but he could have to the new one.
He did much better doing what he did. Of course, he did the right thing. I mean, what we had was an exemplary case of how press freedom ought to work. That is, somebody says something which, frankly, I thought was revolting, and the person who they attack gets the opportunity to say what you said was revolting. That, I think, is what press freedom should do, and too often doesn't.
Maybe
the power of the press means that somebody as powerful as Ed Miliband gets a right of reply, but nobody else does.
But the city editor of the Daily Mail made the point that that should have probably been labelled opinion. Lance, do you think that that would have been fair opinion had it been labelled as such? It was, as it was published, seemed to be an actual news report, and that was one of the biggest beefs that the Labour Party had with it.
Well, I certainly think that it is a fundamental principle of our democracy that people should be free to express their opinions, however offensive they may be, providing they don't break the law in doing so. And we are pretty restrictive in the laws that we impose to limit the freedom of expression. My view is that the Daily Mail is a pretty nasty, right-wing, homophobic, anti-immigrant newspaper. But I absolutely defend its right to hold those views, providing it doesn't harm individuals in the process.
When you were advising Tony Blair, would you have advised him to take on the Mail in the way that Ed Miliband has?
Well, I would have loved him to do that, and he was always reluctant to do so. Gordon Brown also, who succeeded Tony Blair as Prime Minister, really thought that he could win over the Daily Mail and its editor to the Labour cause, and he failed. Interestingly, when I was working in Downing Street for Tony Blair, we did for a while run a thing called Mail Watch, and we used to, every day, we would take round to all the other journalists a list of the stories that the Daily Mail had run and our explanation for why what they claimed to be the facts and the interpretation was wrong. And the Daily Mail hated it. I mean, the problem, I think, with the big, powerful newspaper organisations in this country is that they demand transparency, they demand that everybody else is held to account. But when they're held to account for their behaviour and for their views, they run screaming.
I mean, Ed Miliband has now taken on News International, he's taken on the Daily Mail. This rumble of the Leveson findings, and we don't know what he's going to say just yet, this is going to play out right up until 2015. This will have a big impact on the Labour Party, won't it?
It'll have a big impact on the election, and it makes the media an issue in the run-up to the election, all well and good. I think one of the reasons that Ed Miliband feels more confident in taking on the Murdoch empire and associated newspapers, and others, I guess, if it comes to that, is that he has recognised that the power of those media organisations is a lot less in society and in politics than people thought it was, and that people like Tony Blair thought it was, and that he believes he can realistically stand a chance of winning the next election even if all the Murdoch titles and the associated newspaper titles, the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday, are opposing him. Given all the evidence about how little influence newspapers have, and of course, we're all agreed that the readership of newspapers is drastically falling off. So you've got a much smaller market, and the number of people who are actually influenced by what their newspapers tell them they should think about politics is remarkably small. So I think it's a very healthy thing that he's done what he's done.
Well, indeed, just finally, Ian Dunt, the victims don't trust the press don't trust the politicians, they don't trust each other. I mean, do you see these entrenched positions becoming more entrenched in the months and years to come?
Yeah, you know what's baffling is it doesn't actually take that much negotiation to make this thing work. I mean, there's plenty of elements where I think the press are right in the red lines that they're drawing up. I mean, like I mentioned, the triple lock, their definition of a failing regulator is a far superior one to the one being put in the Royal Charter. And their idea that they have one industry bod on the appointments panel, one of four, does not seem unreasonable to me. However, they don't need to give up on much. And in fact, most of the areas that they are holding their ground are areas where they're fighting against freedom of speech. It's not very often that I say good things about David Cameron. I have to say his reservations, the failure of creating an arbitration system, the failure to ensure the prominence of apologies and the independence of appointments, they're roughly the right sort of area. So I don't think it's impossible that we'll find a good conclusion from all this.
That was Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk. Also on the line was Angela Phillips, reader in journalism at Goldsmiths, University of London. In the studio, I was joined by Sunny Hundal, a blogger and journalist in residence at Kingston University, and Lance Price, the former Director of Communications for the Labour Party and author of the book Where Power Lies. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.